Thank you so much, Mike, and this has been a great program so far. It's my pleasure to be here today on behalf of the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center to take part in this discussion. So we're shifting here from the operational theater to talk about installation energy resilience on this panel. And as we know, and as we've talked about, the Department of Defense relies on access to critical infrastructure to power missions, training, and operations on domestic installations. And as we've seen really over the last year, again and again, that critical infrastructure is at unprecedented risk. We've seen evidence of this in the Colonial Pipeline attack. We've seen public safety power shutoffs in California. We've seen power outages across Texas and Oklahoma. So it's my pleasure today to share this Zoom stage with three great experts in this area, Dr. Paul Stockton, Robert Hughes, and Alexina Jackson, to discuss this overarching question of how do we work across the public and private sector to provide resilient and reliable power to our military installations in this increasingly complex threat environment. So first, I'm going to start with Dr. Paul Stockton to help us understand the nature of these threats. Paul served as President Obama's Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense, where he helped lead the development of the department's mission assurance strategy. He currently chairs the Department of Energy's Advisory Committee on Grid Resilience for National Security. Paul, welcome. I would love to turn the floor over to you to again describe the threat environment we're facing today, both in terms of the physical and cyberspace, and how that impacts US critical infrastructure.
Thanks, Maggie. I'd like to start with a remarkable statement that the Secretary of Energy made last week. Secretary Granholm, when asked if America's adversaries have the ability to shut down our power grid, she said, yeah, they do. That is the threat environment in which we're operating today. And that's why the consortium and all of the folks on this call today are so valuable in terms of strengthening mission assurance for the Department of Defense. That is ensuring that even if the bad guys turn off the flow of grid provided power to defense installations, those installations can still execute their mission essential functions. I'm going to say a few things about the nature of the threat now that'll help folks who are developing new technologies understand how valuable their contributions can be, but also a little bit on how to shape those efforts so they're of greatest value, as Sharon Burke said before, helping our military execute its missions. First of all, let's talk about outage duration. How long are these blackouts going to be that China, Russia, or other potential adversaries are going to seek to inflict? If you still think that cyber attacks are going to be one and done, that they'll look anything at all like the Colonial Pipeline attack, you're kidding yourself. Xi Jinping or other potential adversary leaders are going to sustain attacks on the grid and energy infrastructure in general until they prevail in whatever crisis instigated the cyber attack. We need to get ready for multi-week power outages and size and structure the resilient power inside the fence line accordingly. Multi-week battery storage, everything else that's going to be required. Secondly, we need to think hard, Maggie, about interdependencies. If you've got a big honkin' microgrid inside your military base and you're depending on the flow of natural gas in order to power that generation facility, again, we know that China is going after our natural gas system because the intelligence community has said so. We need to understand interdependencies within the energy sector and also interdependencies for mission execution. Water provides classic example. Water systems need electric power to function. Those water systems that are essential for military bases to function, those systems often lie outside the fence line, just like Fairfax Water provides the water for the Pentagon. So we need to think holistically about what it's going to take to make sure that defense installations and their surrounding communities have the power that they need in order to be able to function. And then finally, we need to think not only about installations inside the United States, but US military bases and partner bases abroad. Incirlik, Turkey, installations in Japan and Korea. Those installations also need resilient on-base power in order to ensure that they can support the regional contingencies that could lead to cyber attacks on the United States itself. Thanks, Maggie. Thanks to you and everybody who's in on the call for enabling me to support your vital work.
Thank you so much, Paul, for laying out the severity of the threats. And I'm so glad we have these two other experts who can speak to how we start to manage these. And starting on that note, I'd love to introduce Bob Hughes. He has 3 decades of experience leading engineering and facilities management organizations in the past with the Department of the Air Force, and more recently in his role with the U.S. Army Office of Energy Initiatives. Bob, you're a manager in this field, a leader in this field for many years. Based on the threats that Paul discussed, and as we know, there's also climate-induced natural disasters that we're facing, like we saw in Texas, and as you talked about, Paul, with the interdependencies, you saw natural gas fail, you saw renewables fail. Bob, how do you manage that, and how do you keep reliable power for our installations, and as Paul was talking about, the surrounding community?
Thank you. I'd like to say pray and cross your fingers, but unfortunately, that's all too often the answer to all of the threats that Paul just laid out. 100%, accurate. That now we don't know where all the risks are coming from. So you talked a little bit about, how long I've been doing this kind of stuff. I spent a lot of time in Tampa, where our biggest planning threat we thought was hurricanes. We're always planning for the storm event. Well, most storm events you can actually plan for and predict. It's the ones that you can't predict that come and get you. They catch you off guard. And so the most important thing, and it's going to sound so simplistic, is to completely understand how your system operates. And just like Paul had said, how interwoven the utilities actually are. When we would plan for recovery, everybody thought they could just put people at it. And in the job I had, I'd beg the people not to come until we could at least flow water, take care of wastewater, and have power. And in an environment like Tampa, we couldn't have 1,000 people just running around the installation without those things. So you have to plan to have multiple solutions in place. And as we know, DoD has long depended on the individual facility diesel generators. And we all know the stories about how well they've been maintained and how unreliable they are, which is where the prayer and cross your fingers comes from. So we need to continue to look for the other alternatives that are now the viable with technologies that we have, the increased, build out of renewable that takes away some of those supply chain lines that Paul was talking about, is that to be able to plan for those other alternatives. And to be able to have multiple fuel sources and ways to be getting power. So I look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bob. And actually, if I can just ask a follow-up to that, you're talking about renewable power. Are you seeing, the examples that you're talking about, are those on base? Are they off base? Where are you seeing examples of that being a way to improve resilience?
So they are both. We had a large push under the Obama administration to increase, investments into renewables, to enter into power purchase agreements with off-base vendors. So we have both scenarios. We have a lot where we have allowed developers and utilities to come on and either lease land or have easements to build out their renewables. One of the benefits that they have is the security that we provide at the fence line. So that's one of the reasons why we are attractive to them. And then another reason why they are attractive to us is that they use their capital, right? We're always looking for private investment, not MILCON, not ERSIP, not direct O&M funding that comes from the appropriation.
Thank you so much. And we definitely want to talk a little bit more about this public and private partnership, since that's the theme, part of the theme of today's event. But before I come back to you, I'd love to introduce Alexina especially since this is her area of expertise. Alexina is a leader in innovative energy solutions, including those that promote clean energy and advanced resilient energy systems for a diverse customer base around the globe. And that's all through her role as Vice President for Customer Innovation and Solutions at the AES Corporation. So Alexina, I'm sure you have a lot to respond to already, but as we're thinking about the increasing complexity of these physical and cyber threats to the energy system, what are the trends in consumer demand that you're seeing at this nexus of clean energy and resilience? Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, Maggie. Yeah, definitely Paul and Bob have already hit on topics of redundancy, of the renewable versus, pipelines, of inside and outside the fence line. So there is a lot to talk about. But all of these come back in my mind to this idea that we're talking about a growing interconnectedness of our energy systems, more distributed energy resources, more Internet of Things, more consumer participation. Environmental stressors, cyber risk, aging infrastructure are also all constraints that we're solving for as we innovate. With increasing points of vulnerability that come with this interconnectedness and the environmental and cyber threats, our customers definitely want to know that while we're building solutions, that we're also thinking about risk mitigation and early detection. There are a bunch of details that we could get to on this, but needless to say, a lot of those risk mitigation strategies and the standards for detection are going to be customer specific. But I also spend a lot of time thinking about how we can even make our infrastructure self-healing. So can we leverage those distributed renewables to provide the flexibility that they can bring to solving the physics equation that is the grid? And that's something that is really an opportunity that's going to be unlocked, I think, with the advancement that we're seeing within our energy sector as a whole. But certainly one solution, which Paul made reference to, that a lot of our customers talk about, is the microgrid, right? Because that can prioritize resilience as an outcome for our customer. And of course, microgrids can be set up in a variety of ways, but I did appreciate the comment about sort of diverse renewable assets, right? So you want to think about how you can build a diverse portfolio within that microgrid. So maybe some solar, some wind, some battery storage to help ease the periods in which the wind's not blowing, the sun's not shining. And these can be connected to even feed the larger community. So back to that idea that the base and the community are actually a symbiotic system. And then of course, if there is a vulnerability event, even if the grid and the community are sharing energy, you can have the option to island the base and feed those critical operations. And of course, the microgrid can also be right-sized. So one size doesn't fit all. You can either oversize that grid, or you can size it appropriately to really just power the critical parts of the operation. So those decision points are available there too, to really provide the solution that the customer is seeking.
Thank you so much. And Paul, I saw you nodding your head. I don't know if you have anything you want to add on there, but if not, I'd love to, again, follow up on this question of private sector and local stakeholder engagement with DoD on these installations across the United States and the world, as you mentioned. But in trying to manage some of the threats that you talked about, how do you see that cooperation moving forward, especially as I know this is something you look at in your role working on grid resilience and national security?
Exactly right. The opportunity exists. In fact, the imperative exists to bring non-traditional DoD partners to bear in the development of the technologies that we just don't have today. And there are obvious examples in the world of batteries and other realms, but I'd emphasize also that advances in security technologies and resilience technologies are going to be important as well. Until recently, all the inverters that we've made, that we've used in the United States to convert solar and wind DC power to AC current are made in China. What could possibly go wrong? A lot of things. We need to get on top of the risk that we're creating new attack surfaces as we strengthen the energy resilience of defense installations. We need to anticipate those possible threat vectors and develop new technologies that can help counter them.
Thank you so much. And Bob, I want to ask you the same question. As you're thinking about strengthening energy resilience and developing solutions, how do you work with the private sector and local partners? You talked about it a little bit, but would love if you could expand.
Yeah, those relationships are vitally important, especially with the community at large. When some of these when we first started focusing on the resilience aspect back in late 2016, we focused on the mission, and the mission is what we have to do in the military. However, as we continue to think about it, being part of that community at large makes it so you don't want to be the beacon on the hill. And to take some of those phrases from a few years ago, but it's still true. And I mean, members live in the community, their families live in the community, we're all part of the community, we rely on the grid that comes from the community. And so those have to be joint planning efforts on how you're going to plan for resilient solutions that serve both parties. We tend to, and this is not incorrect, is to focus on those things like hospitals, police stations, fire departments, places that we are going to need for the community at large to recover, to plan for staging if staging is needed, or whatever the event. And then if it becomes it's something like a cybersecurity event in the Colonial Pipeline and just a shutdown, how are you going to work around it? I mean, how fast did we see gas stations shut off for basically a couple 100 miles all the way up here to DC, right? So, I mean, and it happened all what seemed like instantaneous. So you have to do those, you have to plan. You can't stay isolated. We know that success is definitely an integrated solution that will come from that, and to looking for those opportunities to find ways to partner in the cost, because the cost is a true barrier, right? So we have examples in both the Army and the Air Force where we provided that land, like I said, through an out grant, and it still has to be reviewed by a public commission, and sometimes they don't see the mutual benefit, or there's an increased cost that all the customers of that utility are going to be asked to cover. So it's a puzzle, and it's got a lot of small pieces, that puzzle. So.
Well, thank you for helping us put some of those together. And Alexina, I'm going to ask you to jump in here. We've talked a lot about what happens inside the fence line and outside the fence line. And you, kind of coming from the private sector side, probably have also some concerns about timeliness, and how do you work with the public sector and stay on a commercial timeline. And so maybe you could comment on that a little bit before we go into a lightning round to wrap up.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, a key part of our successful innovation process is really getting to know our customer, understanding their objectives, the outcomes at the center of their mission, their priorities. And all of that is obviously appreciating that the government customer has certain processes, or I think Sharon made some really good points about that at the beginning of this event. But we are definitely looking for opportunities to be very commercially minded. That's commercial in terms of intellectual property terms, and of course, with regard to timeline. So one really interesting way for us as a commercial entity to sort of not ask our customer to change a lot, but to be adaptive to our customer, is to think about things that we can do outside the fence line to bring that commercial timeline as well as that commercial capital to building things that can be leveraged then by the base. So if we think, for example, of putting batteries at substations close to bases, or even like a solar plus battery solution that you might think of sort of as community solar. Well, if you're supporting that community environment and you can create that connection with the base as well, it doesn't have to be just that the base feeds the community, but rather it can go in the inverse as well, which is a really great commercial way to support our government customer.
Thank you so much for that. And since we only have a couple minutes left, there's one more question that I'd like to pose to the group. And if you all could respond, I'll start with you. But what is a new technology or an innovative business model that you view as a multiplier in improving energy resilience? Alexina, I know this is something that that you really focus on day to day.
Yeah, I'm super jazzed about thinking about our energy grid and what that's going to look like in the future. We talk a lot about renewable solutions, distributed energy resources, but to really realize their full deployment and possibility, I think it behooves us to think about the characteristics of the grid 2.0 that's going to enable their fullest optimization, coordination between them, and really thinking about how that grid 2.0 can help us optimize beyond price and physics to things like locational marginal carbon impact of energy generation and energy consumption, but also how that then, a grid 2.0 that could orchestrate, how that could enhance resilience and get real-time responsiveness to risk events.
I think that was great. Paul, do you want to jump in?
Yes, I've got a challenge I'm hoping people on the call can help with, and that is black start. Traditionally, we import power from outside the blacked out region in order to restart generation and serve critical loads. Adversaries will try to create very wide area power outages. We're going to need new technological approaches in order to strengthen the resilience of our black start systems as natural gas-fired generators that are traditionally used for black start begin to go away as we support President Biden's vision of getting to zero carbon. New technologies are going to be absolutely essential to pull that off.
Thank you so much. And Bob, I'm going to hand it over to you for the last word.
Well, for us, technology is getting away from diesel generators. So we talk about, and some was mentioned on the previous panel about the time that it takes and our system of checks and balances and making the smart investments for the long term. Sometimes we're not always on the front end, but distributed generation and control systems and batteries are something that we are still incredibly interested in. We have tried to partner for the natural gas generation units on installations to help the utility with that black start model. And just like Paul said, we're starting to shift away. We know that we're going to get different goals through an executive order here very soon. They're going to refocus what we focus on. So those are coming. New technologies will follow. Speed to us for adopt technology is probably one of our biggest challenges.
Well, thank you so much to this panel. This was an excellent conversation. I know we could keep talking, but unfortunately we have to turn it back over to Mike. So thank you again, and over to you, Mike.